I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Hans Grunberg, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, and Ms. Edem Warsaw, Director, Crisis Response Division, Office of the Coordinator of the Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grunberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, allow me to begin by expressing my deepest sympathies for the civilian suffering in your country and across the wider region. The people of Bahrain, like so many across this region, have lived through weeks of violence imposed upon them and wholly undeserved. We now look to the ceasefire between the United States and Iran to help end this conflict and begin lifting the long shadow of uncertainty and fear it has cast over the region. The stakes for the people of the region, including in Yemen, could not be higher. Yemen has not been spared the gravitational pull of this war. When Ansar Allah launched attacks against Israel at the end of March, there was global concern that the war would expand to another front. I shared that concern. I was also alarmed that Yemen risked again being drawn into a full-on regional confrontation with devastating consequences for its people. So far, Yemen has avoided that fate, but risks remain. I echo the Secretary General's call on the parties to the current conflict in the Middle East to abide by the terms of the ceasefire, and I call on Ansar Allah to refrain from any further attacks. Throughout the past 2 months, I have engaged intensively with the Yemeni parties, including Ansar Allah, as well as regional and international actors. From Amman and on trips to Aden, Moscow, Riyadh, and Washington, D.C., I have been emphasizing the need to safeguard Yemen's peace process from regional escalation, as well as to maintain freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The concerns about maritime security, now gripping the world, have been live issues in Yemen, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aden since 2023. And I reiterate the need for upholding freedom of navigation and international maritime law. Mr. President, my recent trip to Aden was a reminder that after a decade of conflict, Yemen has little margin to absorb more shocks. The new cabinet, under the leadership of Prime Minister Shaya al-Zindani, whom I met in Aden, is prioritizing efforts to stabilize the economy, including regarding electricity provision and public sector salaries, with the vital support of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 2 milestones deserve particular note: the approval of the 2026 state budget, the first in 7 years, and the conclusion of Article 4 consultations between the government and the International Monetary Fund, the first in 11 years. These are positive signs, but Yemen remains highly exposed to the economic repercussions of the regional escalation, and as the global situation has made clear, it is always the poorest and the most vulnerable who bear the heaviest burden. Yemenis across the country have long contended with inadequate public services, delayed salaries, and rising prices. And they will now have to contend with import disruptions and higher fuel and food prices triggered by wider conflict in the Middle East. Yemen is also very dependent on remittances from GCC countries, which are at risk of declining. These pressures fall on a Yemeni economy already weakened by the obstruction of government oil and gas exports, by the division of the central bank, and by the broader weaponization of economic life that has, far too long, made ordinary Yemenis pay the price of decisions taken over their heads. My office continues to engage the parties and other stakeholders in our economic track, working to reduce economic tensions and build arrangements in which the parties have more to gain from cooperation than confrontation. These issues are inseparable from the search for a sustainable political settlement of the conflict. Mr. President, the broad de-escalation that has held inside Yemen since the 2022 truce remains a crucial achievement for the parties to build on. But there are worrying indications, including reports of troop movements, that this relative calm cannot be taken for granted, particularly in a moment of regional turmoil. Moreover, Yemeni civilians continue to suffer the consequences of an unsettled conflict. The devastating Ansar Allah shelling of a Ramadan iftar gathering in Hajjah Governorate, as well as the increased number of sniper incidents near the front lines in Taiz, resulted in civilian casualties, including children. And I reiterate my call for accountability and respect for international humanitarian law. I am also concerned by the casualties during recent demonstrations in Mukalla. President Al-Alimi's call for an investigation is a welcome step, and all actors must exercise restraint. Such incidents underscore the importance of advancing dialogue and shared understandings among Southerners, a point reinforced by the civil society voices I heard during my visit to Aden. Turning to Hudaydah, the United Nations missions to support the Hudaydah Agreement concluded its mandate on the 31st of March in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2813. My office will continue to support the implementation of the agreement through engagements with the parties through our offices in Aden, in Sana'a, and Amman. Achieving a nationwide ceasefire remains the priority, and we will continue our efforts to de-escalate front lines across Yemen. Mr. President, for the past 10 weeks, the parties have been in direct negotiations under UN auspices in Amman on conflict-related detainees. This is the longest round yet of negotiations on this issue. These talks show that negotiations on issues of deep importance to the Yemeni public remain possible even in today's difficult climate. While significant progress has been made, the talks have not yet come to a conclusion, and the parties need to make additional compromises to unlock the releases. I urge the parties to redouble their efforts and bring this process to a positive conclusion. And I remain grateful to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan for hosting these negotiations and the International Committee of the Red Cross for its vital role. The absence of loved ones is also felt deeply by the families of United Nations, NGO, and embassy colleagues who remain arbitrarily detained by Ansar Allah. Of our 73 United Nations colleagues detained, several have been held incommunicado throughout the duration of their detention, while others have been allowed irregular contact with their families. These detentions violate United Nations privileges and immunities and are crippling the United Nations' ability to carry out its mission, with direct consequences for the Yemeni people. I continue to urge Ansar Allah to immediately and unconditionally release all detainees and to halt all criminal proceedings which lack due process. And I count on this Council's steadfast support to push for their release. Mr. President, the way forward for Yemen's peace process is not without challenges. Every escalation in the region deepens the trust deficit between the parties and the concerns with which Yemen is viewed from beyond its borders. But Yemenis need a solution for Yemen. Their future should not be held hostage to regional turmoil. An inclusive political process remains the only viable path to durably resolving the conflict, delivering a secure and prosperous future for Yemenis, and providing the guarantees that the region and the international community need, including on freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Mr. President, in a moment as uncertain as this, there is often a temptation for conflict parties to wait, to let the dust settle, to watch where the chips fall, and to hope that they'll fall in one's favor. To believe that the regional storm might rearrange the table in ways that excuse one from the discomfort of compromise. However, to bet on the storm is to bet on something no one fully controls. The Yemeni parties must instead invest in achieving a political settlement that secures a better future for the Yemeni people. I call on this Council to continue its concerted efforts to help ensure they make this choice. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Adim Wosono.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is our third briefing to the Security Council this year. What I'm about to share is not new, but a deterioration of an already terrible situation, one which worsens every day. Across Yemen, millions of people are surviving day by day. A decade of conflict has left people hanging by a thread. More than 22 million people are surviving day to day. More than 22 million people, nearly half of the population across Yemen, need humanitarian aid, and that number is rising. This crisis is hitting the most vulnerable first and hardest. Hunger is tightening its grip. More than 18 million people face severe hunger. 2 out of every families are forced to skip meals every day. Women and children, of course, as always, hit the hardest. The nutrition crisis continues unabated. 2.2 million children under the age of 5 are acutely malnourished, and 1.3 million pregnant and breastfeeding women face life-threatening complications due to malnutrition. For too many children and too many mothers, this means irreversible, lifelong physical and cognitive damage, stunting, and even death. At the same time, the health system is collapsing. 2 out of every 5 health facilities are not fully functional, leaving more than 19 million people who need health care without it. Vaccine-preventable diseases are spreading fast. Cholera, measles, diphtheria are ravaging communities and places in numbers that place Yemen among the worst in the world. Mr. President, we are trying to respond in one of the most challenging environments in the world today. As you heard from Special Envoy Grunberg, 73 of our United Nations colleagues remain arbitrarily detained by the Houthi de facto authorities, with no or very limited communication with their families. Many of our assets have been seized and our access severely restricted. Faced with this reality, we have been forced to reassess our operations in areas held by de facto authorities. Humanitarian operations continue, and here let me pay tribute to our NGO partners working with such courage and determination, but of course change is needed. We need this Council's support to secure humanitarian access. That is desperately needed. Mr. President, it is over this grim reality that this most recent, still unresolved regional escalation looms large. Prices are rising sharply. Cooking gas is up 26%, while fuel prices have climbed 20%. This matters in a country that imports nearly everything. 90% of wheat is brought in from abroad, and milling itself requires fuel that is also imported. We are also seeing wider supply chain disruptions across the region, making supply routes more costly, less predictable, slowing down what remains of our operations. Mr. President, we cannot allow this catastrophe to continue. Our humanitarian needs and response plan seeks $2.16 billion to deliver life-saving assistance to 12 million people this year. It's a blueprint to avert a far deeper catastrophe. But right now, the gap between resources we have and the soaring humanitarian needs is widening. Last year's appeal was only 29% funded, one of the biggest shortfalls in a decade. Mr. President, let me close by reiterating again our most urgent asks of this Council. First, please use your influence to secure the release of our detained United Nations colleagues, as well as dozens of current and former staff from NGOs, civil society, and the diplomatic community. Push for us to be able to carry out our work safely and without impediment for those who most urgently need our support. Second, please fund the response now. Third, support the Special Envoy's efforts to achieve peace. Without it, this cycle of death, disease, deprivation will continue. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Wosorno for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make a statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, Special Envoy Gromberg and Ms. Wosorno, for your sobering briefings and for your continued determined efforts in such challenging circumstances. I would like to begin by welcoming efforts to build upon the ceasefire we have seen over the past week between Iran and the US. We thank Pakistan and all partners involved for facilitating this important step towards establishing stability in the region and working towards a return to freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. However, recent Houthi attacks against Israel threaten to further destabilize the region and undermine Yemen's security. We urge the Houthis against resuming these unacceptable attacks and refrain from dragging Yemen into the broader conflict. After years of instability and economic hardship, the Yemeni people deserve a peaceful and a secure future. To that end, I commend the strong start made by the new government of Yemen since its formation in February. Early progress on reforms sends an important signal of commitment to improving governance and economic stability. We encourage the government to sustain this momentum, to deliver tangible benefits to the Yemeni people, and to help create the conditions for durable peace and stability. The recent publication of the Yemen Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan in March highlights the deteriorating humanitarian situation. 22 million people in need of assistance, with 18.3 million people who are acutely food insecure. Conflict, economic deterioration, and the impacts of flooding and drought are pushing more communities towards emergency levels of hunger. Without urgent, sustained funding, conditions will worsen further, putting lives at risk. We need to act now and together to address these urgent needs. On the critical issue of weapons smuggling, the UK was pleased to convene members of this council and other affected states last month for an expert briefing on arms smuggling networks utilised by the Houthis, in breach of Security Council Resolution 2254. We look forward to the panel of experts' forthcoming reporting on dual-use components and maritime interdictions. The UK will continue to support the vital work of the panel to sustain momentum in countering Houthi weapons smuggling. Finally, Mr. President, the UK continues to strongly condemn the ongoing detention of aid workers, and we once again call for their immediate release. These actions by the Houthis violate fundamental rights, due process, and shrink the operational space for international NGOs that is vital to support the growing needs of the Yemeni people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of A3, namely the Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, and my own country, Somalia. A3 thanks Special Envoy Hans Gromberg and OCHA Director Ms. Edem Wosorno for their comprehensive briefings. We also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in today's meeting. Mr. President, A3 remains deeply concerned that Yemen continues to face a fragile situation marked by political uncertainty, economic deterioration, and one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. While large-scale hostilities have not returned to previous levels, recent development underscore the continued volatility and the persistent risk of escalation. We reaffirm our full support for an inclusive, Yemeni-led, Yemeni-owned political process under the auspices of United Nations. We commend the Special Envoy's effort to insulate Yemen from the broader regional conflict. We underscore the importance of preserving the space for dialogue to advance a comprehensive political settlement. A3 remains concerned about the tensions that continue to expose the fragility of existing arrangements. We further take note of the expiration of the mandate for the UN mission to support Hudayda's agreement on March 31st, 2026, which marks a significant transition in the Security Council's engagement. We emphasize that the progress on the political track must be accompanied by a tangible improvement in the economic situation. The continued fragmentation of institutions and irregular salary payments are deepening hardship for millions. Addressing these economic challenges remain essential to supporting stability and strengthening public confidence. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Yemen has reached a critical breaking point. The 2026 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, released on March 18, report that 22.3 million people, half of the population, now require humanitarian assistance. Furthermore, 18.3 million people face acute food insecurity. We are profoundly alarmed by the funding collapse facing the humanitarian response. The current UN appeal for $2.16 billion follows a year where a response plan was only 29% funded, the lowest in the history of Yemen crisis. These severe shortfalls have forced humanitarian actors to scale back or suspend critical life-saving programs, notably in the northern areas where WFP's operations have largely ceased due to these funding gaps and continued interference. A3 expresses grave concern regarding the continued detention of UN humanitarian personnel. Such actions, alongside interference in aid delivery, undermine operations and aggravate civilian suffering. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detained personnel and emphasize the importance of safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access. Furthermore, A3 underscores the need to strengthen protection for civilians, particularly children, who continue to bear the consequence of the conflict. We call on all parties to comply fully with international humanitarian law and to cooperate with the United Nations on child protection and accountability mechanisms. To conclude, Mr. President, A3 reiterates its firm support for the Yemeni sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. We stress that lasting peace cannot be achieved through military means, but through dialogue and sustained international engagement. We call on the international community to maintain a strong attention on Yemen and to significantly scale up financial support for the humanitarian operations to prevent further collapse of the essential services. The people of Yemen deserve a future defined not by crisis, but by stability, dignity, and opportunity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Envoy Gronberg and Director Osuno for the briefings, and welcome the permanent representative of Yemen to today's meeting. Lately, the sharp escalation in the Middle East has posed new challenges to the stability in Yemen and the Red Sea. The launch of the US-Iran negotiations in Pakistan is a step in the direction of easing the tension. The pressing priority is to prevent restart of fighting and maintain the hard-won momentum of ceasefire. With no effort spared, the international community should continue to to intensify efforts to promote peace talks and categorically oppose any act that could undermine ceasefire or escalate confrontation. Relevant parties should strictly observe the interim ceasefire arrangements and seek to resolve disputes by political and diplomatic means. President, over the past 2 years, amid ongoing regional turmoil, the situation in Yemen has dragged on with fluctuations. In today's Yemen, the parties to the conflict lack mutual trust. The peace process is stalled. The security situation remains fragile, and humanitarian challenges are daunting. The international community should redouble its efforts to help Yemen find a comprehensive solution to break the stalemate and work together for an early settlement of the Yemen issue. First, we must resolutely advance the political process. China calls on all parties in Yemen to show political resolve, work to relaunch the peace process, resolve differences through dialogue and negotiation, and strive for an early reconciliation and the kickoff of economic rebuilding. The international community should provide support to this end. China notes that the legitimate government of Yemen and the Houthis held meetings on the implementation of the prisoner exchange agreement. We commend the Special Envoy's office for their positive role in this regard and encourage two parties to continue communication engagement to achieve concrete results. Second, every effort must be made to maintain a stable security situation. In early March, the legitimate government of Yemen and the Houthis exchanged fire in Taiz, resulting in casualties. China calls on both parties to exercise restraint and avoid any escalatory actions. The Special Envoy's office should exercise its role as a ceasefire monitor and engage with both parties to the conflict to prevent new clashes. It is a shared responsibility of all to safeguard the security of the Red Sea shipping lanes. The rights of merchant ships from all countries to navigate these waters in accordance with international law must be fully respected. Third, the humanitarian situation requires prompt relief. The recent UN Emergency Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen forecasts 22 million people in urgent need of humanitarian aid, an increase of 2.8 million from last year, reflecting a rapidly deteriorating trend. Some organizations note localized famine in their assessments. It is particularly alarming. China calls on the international community to provide more emergency humanitarian aid to Yemen and try to secure funding for humanitarian needs to avert a large-scale humanitarian crisis. Fourth, we must defend the bottom line of international humanitarian law. Protecting civilian and the security of civilian infrastructure is an internationally recognized fundamental principle of international humanitarian law, and the safety and security of UN personnel must be effectively guaranteed. China expresses grave concern over the continued detention of 73 UN personnel and once again calls on the Houthis to release them immediately and unconditionally, thereby creating conditions for humanitarian institutions to resume operations in relevant areas. Together with the international community, China stands ready to make unrelenting efforts for the political settlement of the Yemen issue and return of peace and stability to the Middle East at an early date. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Edem Wosono for their comprehensive briefings today. Madam President, the people of Yemen continue to suffer a vast humanitarian emergency, as we have heard from the briefers. In light of the escalating tensions in the region, it's crucial that Yemen is not further drawn into the broader conflict. Denmark strongly condemns the recent strikes by the Houthis against Israel, which also threaten greater regional destabilization. And we underscore the need for ensuring maritime security and freedom of navigation to allow for the free flow of trade and goods, including humanitarian goods. We call on the Houthis to immediately cease military actions. De-escalation is crucial also to prevent further regional spillover. Madam President, as we have heard, in 2026, more than 22 million people, including 11 million women and girls, will require humanitarian assistance and protection services across Yemen. Further deterioration of food insecurity is alarming, with more than 18 million people facing acute food insecurity. Millions of children are malnourished. We urge Member States to support Yemen's humanitarian response plan to enable timely and life-saving interventions for the people of Yemen. Rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need is crucial, and we call on the Houthis to allow and facilitate such access in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law. Denmark strongly condemns the continued detention by the Houthis of 73 UN staff, along with others from civil society and diplomatic missions, and reiterate our demand for their immediate and unconditional release. Madam President, it's critical that progress is made towards an inclusive Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political solution under UN auspices to reach a negotiated political settlement that can sustainably end this conflict. We hope further progress can be made on the exchange of conflict-related prisoners, which could contribute to the much-needed trust building between the parties. In closing, Denmark also takes note of the closure of the UN mission to support the Hudaydah Agreement on 31st March, in accordance with the Resolution 2813, with the transfer of its residual tasks to the Office of the Special Envoy. We would like to use this opportunity to thank UN colleagues that served in UNMAHA, and we reaffirm the importance for the UN to continue supporting the implementation of the Hudaydah Agreement towards lasting stability in Hudaydah and in Yemen. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and OCHA Director Edem Busurno for their insightful briefings, and I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in this meeting. In the light of today's briefings and evolving situation on the ground, I wish to outline 3 key points. First, we express our profound concern over the current situation in the Middle East, and we unequivocally condemn the move by the Houthis to enter the conflict by conducting direct military strikes against Israel. It risks pulling Yemen into a wider regional confrontation at a time when it is least able to handle more instability. Moreover, any escalation would not just deepen Yemen's struggles, but could see hostilities spill into the Red Sea, disrupting yet another vital maritime corridor for global trade and energy flows, and even more so for the humanitarian flows. The hostilities must come to an immediate halt, and we call on all actors to exercise utmost restraint and focus on de-escalation and dialogue. Second, amid regional turmoil, the recently published 2026 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan for Yemen paints an increasingly alarming picture. The number of people in need has risen from approximately 19.5 million in 2025 to over 22 million in 2026. And we heard the very grim reality described by Ms. Vosorno just now. While the European Union remains the leading donor, also in 2026, urgent additional international financing is needed to avoid a repeat of last year's critically underfunded response. Notably, this plan was developed before the latest escalation in the Middle East and does not yet account for the economic shocks from disrupted maritime routes, nor the Houthis ramping up hostilities. These factors that stretch supply chains and will likely exacerbate an already devastating humanitarian emergency even further. Ongoing floods add to the devastation, displacing the population, damaging vital infrastructure, and heightening the urgency of humanitarian aid. And we strongly condemned, again, the continued detention of 73 United Nations and humanitarian personnel, which is unacceptable under any circumstances. And moreover, each additional day of detention undermines critical relief operations. And we call, yet again, for the immediate and unconditional release and stress the obligation of all parties to ensure the safety, security, and unimpeded access of humanitarian workers. Third, we would like to acknowledge the ongoing efforts by the government of Yemen to stabilize the governance amid extraordinarily difficult circumstances. In this regard, Latvia welcomes the recent statement by the IMF Executive Board issued following the resumed Article 4 consultations with Yemen, which recognize the government's steps and commitment that have contributed to stabilizing the economy and enabling the delivery of essential public services. As significant downside risks remain, we encourage the continuation of these policies. It also remains important to continue efforts to stabilize the situation in the southern governorates and advance towards a sustained and inclusive dialogue in the south of Yemen. Likewise, we encourage all diplomatic initiatives for a comprehensive and inclusive political process involving all relevant parties across Yemen, and with the full and meaningful participation of women under the auspices of the United Nations. And Latvia reiterates its strong and unwavering support for the Special Envoy's indispensable mediation efforts, now also enhanced by the core tasks of UNMAHA. In conclusion, Madam President, let me underscore that amid the regional escalation, all Yemeni parties must maintain momentum in advancing political dialogue and focus on urgent domestic priorities, and no actor must impede this path. Yemeni's lives, dignity and aspirations must remain central to every decision, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and OCHA Director Edim Wosornu for their comprehensive briefings. I appreciate the sustained efforts of the Special Envoy in advancing stability and supporting a peaceful resolution in Yemen. The situation in Yemen remains deeply concerning and continues to demand sustained international attention. Despite ongoing engagement by the UN, the political process continues to face persistent challenges. There is genuine expectation that efforts towards a comprehensive settlement must deliver tangible progress, while also carefully accounting for the evolving realities on the ground. Unfortunately, Yemen's internal dynamics further complicate the peace process. The Presidential Leadership Council is the internationally recognized and legitimate authority. However, the presence of competing actors with divergent political agendas, particularly in the south, continues to undermine unity and hinder efforts to establish a coherent national framework. This fragmentation risks weakening state institutions and obstructing progress towards a comprehensive political settlement. In this context, it is essential that all parties and Yemeni stakeholders demonstrate renewed political will, engage constructively with the Special Envoy, and participate in an inclusive, UN-facilitated, Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process. Such a process must move beyond incremental measures and preserve the unity, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Yemen while reflecting the legitimate aspirations of the Yemeni people. At the same time, developments in Yemen cannot be viewed in isolation from the evolving regional security environment. Yemen must not be adversely affected or drawn into a regional conflict. It is also important to stress that attacks targeting maritime routes are unacceptable, as they disrupt global trade flows, heighten risks to energy and food supply chains, and would accentuate the growing regionalization of the conflict. The free and unimpeded flow of commercial shipping through the Bab al-Mandab must not be impeded. The risk of Yemen becoming further entangled in wider regional confrontation, including through the involvement of non-state actors, must be avoided. It is therefore essential that all parties exercise the utmost restraint, refrain from actions that could escalate tensions, and fully comply with their obligations under international law. Madam President, the humanitarian situation remains dire and requires urgent, coordinated, and sustained action. According to OCHA's 2026 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, 22.3 million people require humanitarian assistance and protection, while 18.3 million face acute food insecurity, and another 19.3 million need access to essential health service. This is a serious humanitarian crisis. In this regard, it is incumbent upon international donors to urgently increase predictable and flexible humanitarian funding, upon all parties on the ground to ensure safe, rapid and unhindered humanitarian access, and upon UN and OCHA to continue coordinating and delivering assistance effectively to those most in need. Without these coordinated, collective, and concrete steps, the humanitarian situation risks further deterioration. Pakistan reiterates its strong condemnation of the continued arbitrary detention of UN, humanitarian personnel, and diplomatic staff, as well as unlawful seizure of UN premises and assets in area under Houthi control. These actions contravene international law and undermine humanitarian work. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detained personnel and for full respect for the privileges and immunities of UN personnel, facilities, and assets. Madam President, the sustained engagement remains fundamental to advance the goal of a comprehensive political settlement supported by a stable regional environment and complemented by robust humanitarian assistance. That is the only viable path forward. The Security Council must continue to play a constructive and unified role in advancing these efforts with a clear focus on peace, stability, and the well-being of the Yemeni people. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We would like to thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, and the Director of the Crisis Response Division of OCHA, Edem Wosornu, for their valuable contributions. We would like to extend our most cordial welcome to the representative of Yemen to this meeting. Over a decade of conflict has left Yemen with grave humanitarian needs and generalized displacement. According to the International Organization for Migration, in 2026, over 22.3 Yemenis require humanitarian assistance. This includes 10.95 million women and girls, among them 1.3 million pregnant and breastfeeding women that need specific support when it comes to protection and basic services. Excellencies, throughout the last year, our request and support to the Special Envoy Hans Grunberg have been focused on his efforts to secure the release of humanitarian workers arbitrarily detained. We would like to thank him for his efforts, and we reiterate our support to him. Nevertheless, unfortunately, in less than a week, we've observed how this number of detainees has increased to 73 people. This includes representatives of the United Nations, national and international NGOs, as well as members of civil society and the diplomatic corps. These despicable acts carried out by the Houthis hinder the efforts of this organization to support communities throughout Yemen, promote peace, prevent a greater escalation of the conflict, and defend the rights of all Yemenis who remain trapped in a situation of continuous violence. The absurd attempt by the Houthis to use the conflict in the Middle East is proof of this group's selfishness. They are willing to sacrifice the tranquility and general well-being of Yemen in order to gain prominence. Madam President, the military actions that have extended throughout the Middle East are, of course, creating direct consequences that are beginning to be felt throughout all countries in the region. Yemen is not the exception. The obstruction of the Strait of Hormuz has caused a spike in energy prices with impacts that go beyond regional borders. Therefore, we reiterate our firm and unwavering position. No critical maritime route should be threatened, nor used as an instrument for pressure or blackmail. The Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, or any other strategic route should not be put at risk, nor should they be closed. Maritime security is one of the fundamental pillars of global economic stability. Given the aforementioned, we underline the need for this Council to remain constantly vigilant over the evolution of events in Yemen. We also urge the government of Yemen to provide continuity for the Southern Dialogue as a critical mechanism to promote inclusion, strengthen political dialogue, and advance national reconciliation. Only through a process that is participative, inclusive, and sustained over time will it be possible to consolidate a lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we wish to thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and Adam Wosornu for their briefings. The process of Yemeni resolution has for a number of years now been stagnant, and the latest U.S.-Israeli aggression targeting Iran has brought into this situation new, unpredictable changes and shifts. Washington and Western Jerusalem have generated large-scale escalation in the Middle East, and unfortunately, the Yemeni Ansar Allah movement has found itself dragged into this situation, and this has generated risks of even greater alienation of prospects for normalization. Against the backdrop of regional turbulence, we do not see indications of a resumption of proactive efforts on the roadmap for resolution in Yemen, which began more than 2 years ago, which has not yet brought about any tangible result. The lack of progress in the peace process and growing mistrust among the Yemeni protagonists is generating, in turn, an ongoing deterioration of the military situation along their line of contact. All of this is generating risks of reigniting the hot phase of the civil war. Madam President, we believe that the main task of the membership of the Security Council on the Yemeni front is to do everything possible to promptly and expeditiously normalize the situation in that country. Current day developments clearly bear this out. There's a need to focus all efforts in helping the parties to the conflict, including the Ansar Allah movement, find common ground and to foster compromise. At the same time, it is important to prompt the parties to renounce mutual recriminations and mistrust. Small steps in one another's direction, including the exchange of prisoners of war, can help to bring this about. The optimal basis for comprehensive and long-term resolution in Yemen remains the above-mentioned roadmap, the updated version of which should be signed by all Yemeni parties without delay. In this connection, we support the efforts of the Special Envoy, and we call for the pursuit of ongoing and other trajectories within the robust configuration of mediation efforts. For our part, we stand ready to do everything possible to facilitate this. Furthermore, we will continue to engage in constructive cooperation with the official Yemeni authorities as well as influential political forces in the country. This includes the Ansar Allah movement, as well as with our friends and our partners in the region. We call upon other members of the international community to follow suit. We caution them against attempts to antagonize or to isolate any of the Yemeni parties, including the Houthis. The Houthis represent an integral component of the Yemeni political landscape. Without their engagement, the resolution is doomed to failure. Madam President, there is a need for urgent action to be undertaken to address the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen. Nearly half of the population, 20 million people, need humanitarian assistance in one form or another. There are grave problems related to food security, drinking water, medicine, access to medical institutions that are plaguing the country. A large share of those in need are internally displaced persons. We see a glaring, chronic underfinancing for specialized humanitarian programs. The situation is further escalated by the forced reduction of humanitarian coverage by UN agencies owing to the unresolved issues with the humanitarian personnel who have been detained by the Houthis. Presently, the lion's share of assistance deliveries to Yemeni people is being shouldered by non-governmental structures who remain present in regions under Ansar Allah control. However, these organizations, by definition, do not possess the resources which are available to the international organization, the United Nations. Under these circumstances, it is an important principle for the architecture for humanitarian assistance in that country to remain unchanged. There is a need to provide for sustained access to preserve the space for humanitarian activity and to raise the level of protection for humanitarian personnel. We recall the importance of prioritization of preserving UN presence in all of the country's territory. To conclude, we reaffirm our commitment to Yemen's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
I would like to thank the President for convening this briefing, as well as the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Gronberg, and the Director of the Crisis Response Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, Ms. Edem Wosornu. For their respective presentations, I would like to greet the delegations that are with us today. Mr. President, Colombia reaffirms its full support to the good offices of the Special Envoy and the humanitarian work carried out by the UN system in Yemen. My country also endorses its support to a political process that is broad and inclusive and ensures the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Yemen, and that at the very same time allows for some relief for the suffering of the civilian population, especially in a regional context characterized by growing tensions and risks of escalation. My delegation is closely following the complex combination of challenges that Yemen is facing today, on top of persistent internal tensions, including institutional fragility. In the recent incidents that happened in the south of the country, there is a real risk that the country could be dragged into a broader regional confrontation. In this context, it is extremely important to avoid an escalation of the conflict and preserve the progress achieved. Colombia reiterates the Special Envoy's emphasis on the need to reactivate a political process that reflects the current realities in Yemen and that produces tangible results. In that framework, my country considers that it is vital to adopt a comprehensive approach that coherently articulates the political, economic, and security dimensions in order to create trust among the parties and establish a solid basis for sustainable peace. The humanitarian situation continues to be alarming. The arbitrary detention of UN and humanitarian staff is particularly alarming, as well as the suspension or reduction of essential operations. This has a direct and negative impact on the supply of vital services. Colombia, therefore, reiterates our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all UN and humanitarian personnel that remains detained. We also call for ensuring safe, sustained, and unrestricted access based on international humanitarian law. Mr. President, our coherent and sustained support contributes to creating favorable conditions for a sustainable peace. We are convinced of this. This is why Colombia reaffirms its commitment to continue supporting the efforts of the United Nations and the international community geared towards stabilizing Yemen. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and OCHA Director Eden Wozournou for their insightful briefings. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in this meeting. Mr. President, I would like to make the following points. First, Yemen remains at the edge of plunging deeper into a protracted security and humanitarian crisis exacerbated by regional instability and severe humanitarian and socio-economic repercussions deriving from a prolonged conflict. The Houthis' arbitrary decision to engage militarily against Israel with the launch of ballistic missile and drone attacks in the Tel Aviv area is both deplorable and condemnable. It is imperative to safeguard Yemen from any further escalation that risks dragging the country into a regional conflict, thus endangering profoundly its prospects of stability, peace, and humanitarian recovery. Second, unimpeded passage of commercial and merchant vessels must be always safeguarded, thus keeping international maritime trade routes continuously open and safe. Freedom of navigation and maritime security in the Red Sea region remain critical, all the more in light of prolonged disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. Houthis' persistent threats of imminent attacks against international commercial vessels transiting Bab al-Mandeb and the Red Sea further aggravate an already fragile security environment, placing international shipping, global energy and food supply chains, as well as international trade stability, at considerable risk. EU naval operations Aspides, within its defensive mandate, plays a crucial role in safeguarding freedom of navigation in the Red Sea region and ensuring the protection of international shipping. Greece will continue to actively support the operation and its objectives. Third, the resumption of peace negotiations aiming at a permanent and viable peace solution on the Yemeni conflict is vital and long overdue. There is no substitute to negotiation efforts for achieving a lasting and enduring peace through an inclusive, Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process under the auspices of the United Nations, with full respect to the country's unity, sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. In this context, we reiterate our unwavering support to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and on his enduring efforts to revitalize the peace process. Fourth, ensuring a safe and enabling humanitarian environment remains of high priority. We reiterate our strong call for the immediate and unconditional release of all United Nations personnel, humanitarian workers, of non-governmental organizations and diplomatic mission staff who continue to be arbitrarily detained by the Houthis. The protection of UN personnel and the inviolability of UN premises must be upheld at all times in accordance with international law. Lastly, Mr. President, we further welcome the 2026 Yemen Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, which provides a focused and prioritized framework for delivering life-saving assistance and essential protection services to all Yemenis in need. Sustained and predictable financial support remains of essence in addressing the scale and urgency of the humanitarian crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to our briefers. The Houthis escalated their destabilizing activity in the region by launching missile and drone attacks against Israel on at least 6 occasions, most recently on April 4th. They have made common cause with the Islamic Republic of Iran and acted in support of its violations of international law. The Houthis' willingness to drag Yemen into conflict for the sake of its benefactors in Tehran is the latest demonstration of its total disregard for the people of Yemen. Inside Yemen, the Houthis continue to detain, attack, and terrorize their fellow Yemenis. On March 16th, the Houthis launched a missile strike against Yemeni families gathered after an iftar meal, killing 10 people, including 6 children. This was preceded by the forced disappearance of several Sunni imams, part of a larger pattern of Houthi repression of Sunni religious practices. Moreover, the Houthis have unjustly detained more than 70 UN staff, along with humanitarian workers and other staff of civil society organizations in diplomatic missions, including the US mission. We call for their immediate and unconditional release. The Iranian regime has long enabled the Houthis' destabilizing activities through the supply of arms and related material and logistical and intelligence support. This is in clear defiance of this Council's resolutions. We call on all vessels bound for Houthi-controlled ports to comply with the UN verification and inspection mechanism requirements, as the Republic of Yemen Ministry of Transportation has reiterated to international shipping companies and port authorities. Colleagues, Resolution 2817 represented the international community's consensus that we cannot sit idly by as the Iranian regime and its proxies and partners undermine regional and international stability. All member states must abide by resolutions to deprive the Houthis of the resources needed for their destabilizing activities. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I wish first and foremost to thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Hans Grunberg, as well as the Director of the Crisis Response Division of OCHA, Madam Edem Wosornu, for their briefings. I also welcome the presence among us of the Permanent Representative of Yemen. Mr. President, first and foremost, France condemns in the strongest terms the missile strikes perpetrated by the Houthis against Israel in recent days. These strikes have resulted in regional escalation. France calls for utmost restraint and for an immediate halt to any military operations in order to prevent further spread of the conflict. Moreover, France recalls our unstinting support for maritime security and for the freedom of navigation. We will continue in this regard to maintain and uphold our commitment under the European Union Defence Maritime Security Operation, EUNAVFOR Aspides, in accordance with international law and together with our European and international partners. Second, France demands the immediate, unconditional release of all United Nations personnel, as well as NGO staff and those of diplomatic missions who have been arbitrarily detained by the Houthis. These detentions fly in the face of international law, and they have lasted for far too long. As we recalled less than a week ago, attacks against humanitarian personnel are unacceptable. Security Council Resolution 2730 must be complied with. These acts impede deliveries of humanitarian assistance, which the Yemeni people desperately need at a time when the situation continues to deteriorate. The recent United Nations assessment is categorical. As compared to 2025, 2.8 million additional people need humanitarian assistance. Children and women are particularly vulnerable. Third, France recalls our commitment to the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Yemen. We support the efforts of consolidation of the Yemeni government, which are conducted by said government, and we reiterate our support to the new government, which needs to work towards stabilization of the country and to meet the basic needs of their people. We will continue to undertake efforts to support legitimate authorities for the benefit of the population. France also supports the prospects of the conduct in Saudi Arabia of an inclusive dialogue for resolution to the question of the south of Yemen, as was announced early this year by President Alimi. France, lastly, reaffirms our full support for the efforts of the Special Envoy, whose efforts are of critical importance. France calls upon all Yemeni stakeholders to engage in good faith in efforts with a view to resuming the political process under the aegis of the United Nations, which alone can help to establish a lasting peace in Yemen. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Bahrain. أصحاب السعادة أود أن أشكر
Your Excellencies, I would like to thank Mr. Hans Grunberg, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General to Yemen, and Ms. Edem Wusorno, Director of Operations and Advocacy at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, for their valuable briefings. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of the Brotherly Republic of Yemen, His Excellency Ambassador Abdullah Al-Saadi. At this critical juncture facing the Arab Gulf region, in light of the serious security and economic challenges it is experiencing, the question of preserving Yemen's stability takes on particular importance. This necessitates sparing Yemen the repercussions of these tensions, avoiding its entanglement in regional conflicts that would further complicate its crises and prolong the suffering of its people, or turning its territory into a platform for the implementation of Iranian agendas. This, in turn, would help advance the political process toward a comprehensive and sustainable solution that fulfills the aspirations of the brotherly Yemeni people for security, stability, and development. In this context, we would like to underscore the following points. First, reaffirming full support for the Presidential Leadership Council, headed by His Excellency Dr. Rashad Al-Alemi, and for the efforts undertaken by the Yemeni government to advance development and reconstruction, preserve security and stability, and reach a comprehensive political settlement in accordance with the Gulf Initiative and its implementation mechanism, as well as the outcomes of the Comprehensive National Dialogue Conference and Security Council Resolution 2216. This is in a manner that preserves Yemen's sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, and independence. In this regard, we reiterate our support for the efforts of the UN and its Special Envoy to Yemen, Mr. Hans Grunberg, to reach a comprehensive political solution that meets and fulfills the aspirations of the Yemeni people for security, stability, and prosperity. Second, in light of the harsh humanitarian conditions and the severe deterioration of food security in Yemen, the Houthi militia continues to threaten to drag Yemen into military adventures and regional conflicts, including the threats to close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, without any regard to the consequences this would have for Yemen, the region, and the global economy. Such actions deepen the subjugation of Yemeni affairs to external forces. These threats are linked to broader attempts to impose a reality that restricts freedom of navigation in vital maritime corridors and to use them as a tool of economic pressure against the international community, particularly in the context of the closure imposed by Iran on the Strait of Hormuz, all in flagrant violation of international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, including resolutions 552 and 2817. My country further stresses the importance of safeguarding maritime security and freedom of navigation in vital waterways, particularly in the Red Sea and the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. We stress our rejection of any threats that undermine the safety of international navigation or that destabilize regional security. In this context, the Kingdom of Bahrain emphasizes that any disruption in these vital passages would undermine humanitarian response efforts, negatively affect regional security and stability, as well as harm global trade and supplies of energy, food, and medicine. The Kingdom also renews its condemnation of the continued arbitrary detention by the Houthi militia of the United Nations staff, diplomatic mission personnel, and workers in non-governmental organizations, and calls for their immediate and unconditional release in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2813. Third, my country affirms the importance of reaching a comprehensive political settlement in Yemen. that ends the crisis in a sustainable manner and preserves its sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity in accordance with agreed international references and relevant security resolutions. Thank you.
Function as a President of the Council, I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
Allow me, my dear brother, Ambassador Jamal Arwa'i, to extend my congratulations to you and the brotherly Kingdom of Bahrain for presiding over the Council during this month. I would like to wish you every success in your duties. I would also like to express my appreciation to your predecessor, the permanent representative of the friendly USA, for the successful presidency of the Council last month. I further extend my thanks to Mr. Hans Gransberg and Mrs. Ida Mosorno for their briefings. Mr. President, our meeting today comes at a time when the region is facing highly complex developments, particularly in light of the unjustified and blatant Iranian attacks targeting the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. This was a flagrant violation of international law, the provisions of international law, the Charter of the United Nations, and the principles of good neighborliness. These actions reflect the Iranian regime's continued insistence on exporting crises, spreading chaos, and undermining security and stability in the region. The government of Yemen reiterates its firm rejection and strong condemnation of these attacks, including those carried out directly or through proxies and militias affiliated with the Iranian regime. We warn against the continued Iranian interference in Yemen's internal affairs through the financing, arming, and support of the terrorist Houthi militias. They push them to be implicated in regional conflicts that serve Iran's agenda and interests. Such actions aim to undermine state institutions, erode sovereign decision-making, transform Yemeni territory into platforms for extortion, and threaten regional and international peace and security. The implication of the Houthi militias in defending the Iranian regime clearly demonstrates the close linkage between these terrorist militias and the destabilizing Iranian project in the region. Since their coup against constitutional legitimacy and the aspirations of the Yemeni people, the terrorist Houthi militias have persistently opened multiple fronts of war, turning Yemen into an arena for regional conflict in implementation of the Iranian agenda. They are seeking to evade the requirements of peace, prolonging the conflict in order to entrench their control without regard for Yemen's interests, security, or stability. Recent developments confirm that the continued possession by the Houthi militias of weapons and military technology constitutes a fundamental challenge to any future political process. It undermines the foundations of state building and threatens security and stability in Yemen and the wider region. The government of Yemen affirms that any future political process must be based on the restoration of state institutions, the monopoly of arms in the hands of the state, and the end of all forms of armed rebellion. This would ensure the establishment of a political system founded on partnership, respect for national sovereignty, the Constitution, and the rule of law. This requires a strong international support to enable the Yemeni government to extend its authority over the entire national territory. It will also put an end to Iranian interference and enhance the prospects for reaching a just and comprehensive political solution in accordance with agreed-upon references for a most Security Council Resolution 2216. Mr. President, with regard to the issue of detainees, prisoners, and abductees, we highly appreciate the efforts led by the United Nations in this important humanitarian track. We reiterate the Yemeni government's strong commitment to ensure its success, for this stems from its firm commitment to alleviating the suffering of dozens of Yemeni families. We hope for a swift implementation of previously agreed-upon arrangements, the completion of prisoner exchange agreement, and the release of all detainees, prisoners, and abductees, in accordance with the principle of all for all without conditional restriction as stipulated in the Stockholm Agreement. We also hope that this important step will serve as an entry point for closing this humanitarian file and a foundation for building the trust necessary for any comprehensive peace process in Yemen. In this context, we warn against the Houthi militia's intention to take judicial measures through illegitimate courts affiliated with them against abductees, including employees of the United Nations agencies and international and national NGOs, as well as diplomatic missions. This would be a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and a direct challenge to the appeals of the international community and this esteemed council. We reiterate our demand for their immediate and unconditional release. Mr. President, the Yemeni government continues to build on the progress achieved in the economic recovery and reform plans, including strengthening the independence of the central bank, protecting the national currency, and enhancing oversight institutions, building strong state institutions, ensuring the provision of basic services to citizens, and reinforcing administrative reforms. In this regard, the 2026 general budget has been approved for the first time in years, representing an important milestone in restoring the regular functioning of state institutions and the exercise of its sovereign functions, including the sound planning of public resources and stressing and defining expenditure priorities in accordance with the national vision based on principles of discipline and transparency. In parallel, the government has adopted its program and priorities for 2026. The latter focuses on strategic objectives, including strengthening governance and transparency principles, activating oversight systems, consolidating political and security stability while achieving sustainable economic recovery. It also includes extending state authority and the rule of law while ensuring access to sustainable basic services, access to justice, promoting institutional reform, advancing digital transformation, strengthening social cohesion, and empowering human capital. In this context, we appreciate the fraternal and supportive role played by our brothers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, including the support of the state budget. This constitutes a fundamental pillar in strengthening the resilience of state institutions. It has helped directly in empowering and enabling the government to fulfill its duties while maintaining economic stability during this highly complex financial and economic phase. The Yemeni government reiterates once again that urgent support from development partners and donor institutions and funds at this stage is a decisive factor in achieving economic stability while enhancing opportunities for economic recovery and development to alleviate the human suffering caused by the war and the destructive practices of the Houthi militias. The government reaffirms its commitment for continued coordination with the international community and donor partners, while expanding and developing support mechanisms and channels in a way that would serve the path of economic recovery and alleviate the humanitarian crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Yemen for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite the Council members to informal consultation to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.